Hello, my name is Austin Habish, the founder of Think Catholic, and you're listening to the Summa podcast, where we study St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa Theologiae in a way simple and insightful for anyone to understand. The Summa podcast is brought to you by Think Catholic. Taking 2 questions in the Summa a day, we'll seek to summarize St. Thomas's responses, discovering the brilliance of Aquinas and his Catholic faith. This is day 78. So let's get started. We're covering today questions 34 and 35 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the goodness and malice of pleasures and of pain or sorrow in itself. The translation that I always use in these podcasts is the one generously provided to me by Ave Maria Press, the 5-volume set translated by the Fathers of the English Dominican province, which you can now get at a discounted price from Ave Maria Press's site by typing in the code SUMMA10. And so here we go. Article 1, whether every pleasure is evil. As a reminder on how morality comes into play, whether in regard to the passions or our actions, St. Thomas reminds us, good and evil in the moral order depend on agreement or disagreement with reason. Therefore, insofar as a pleasure is elicited by an object, circumstance intended in, that is, in accord with right reason, it is morally good pleasure. For example, like taking pleasure in food that's both healthy and at the right time, in the right amount, and for the right reasons. An evil pleasure would be like taking pleasure in the act of adultery or in gluttonous eating. In this way, either in taking pleasure in an evil act or in taking pleasure in some particular good, but in an evil way, pleasure can be said to be evil. As St. Thomas says, the temperate man does not shun all pleasures, but those that are immoderate and contrary to reason. Article 2, whether every pleasure is good. It seems that our previous article was the opinion of the Stoics, and our current article is the opinion of the Epicureans, as St. Thomas writes. While some of the Stoics maintain that all pleasures are evil, the Epicureans held that pleasure is good in itself, and that consequently all pleasures are good. Then St. Thomas gives us the correct distinctions to escape these two extreme positions. He responds, pleasant depends on agreement with the appetite, which tends sometimes to that which is in discordant from reason. Consequently, not every object of pleasure is good in the moral order, which depends on the order of reason. So again, pleasures follow upon the attainment of some perceived good, but simply because something is perceived to be good doesn't make it actually good for oneself or in conformity with right reason. An adulteress may find pleasure in adultery. That doesn't make adultery reasonable. It is always unreasonable. Therefore, not all pleasures are morally good. Article 3, whether any pleasure is the greatest good. Aquinas responds, the greatest good of everything is its last end, and the end is twofold, namely, the thing itself and the use of that thing. Accordingly, man's last end may be said to be either God, who is the supreme good simply, or the enjoyment of God, which implies a certain pleasure in the last end. And in this sense, a certain pleasure of man may be said to be the greatest among human goods. In other words, the greatest good, objectively speaking, is God, who is our last end or goal in the beatific vision. But since the attainment of God will certainly elicit pleasure in us, from this perspective, in considering pleasure as included or following upon our attainment of God, we can also call it our final end or greatest good. As succinctly put by Aquinas in this article, that pleasure is the greatest good is due not to the mere fact that it is pleasure, but due to the fact that it is a perfect repose in the perfect good. Article 4, whether pleasure is the measure or rule by which to judge moral good or evil. Pleasure can give away a good or evil will, because the will rests in the end or takes pleasure in the attained good which was sought for. Therefore, if a man's will takes pleasure in evil things, then the pleasure itself would indicate a disordered or evil will, while a man whose will takes pleasure in good and holy things would indicate that he has a good and rightly ordered will. St. Thomas says, all pleasures are uniform in the point of their being repose of the appetite in something good, and in this respect, pleasure can be a ruler measure because that man is good whose will rests in the true good, and that man evil whose will rests in evil. And with that, we move on to our next question of this episode, question 35, of pain or sorrow in itself. Article 1, whether pain is a passion of the soul. 2 things are required for pain, according to Aquinas: conjunction with some evil and perception of this conjunction. And since the good is the proper object of the appetite, for we love and we will goods, then so too on the radar is going to be the lacks or the missingnesses which can be found in these goods, what we call evils. And since pain is something we endure or suffer, we can truly call it a passion insofar as we have a perception of this suffering, which makes it not merely an undergoing of the body, but also a passion of the soul. Article 2, whether sorrow is the same as pain. Aquinas writes, just as that pleasure which is caused by an exterior apprehension is called pleasure but not joy, so too that pain which is caused by an exterior apprehension is called pain indeed, but not sorrow. Accordingly, sorrow is a species or kind of pain, as joy is a species of pleasure. In other words, sorrow is a kind of pain. There are physical evils which cause physical pain, yet as those evils become known interiorly, or come to the interior appetite directly, either via the imagination or intellect, then they cause sorrow. So within the broader category of pain is found specifically interior pain, which we term sorrow. We see that difference in part in the following words from Aquinas. External sense perceives only what is present, but the interior cognitive power can perceive the present, past, and future. Consequently, sorrow can regard present, past, and future, whereas bodily pain, which follows apprehension of the external sense, can only regard something present. Article 3, whether sorrow or pain is contrary to pleasure. And this question should be pretty easy for us to answer after all that we've covered up to this point. St. Thomas answers this question more or less in a sentence. He writes, since the objects of pleasure and sorrow or pain are the present good and then the present evil are contrary to one another, it follows that pain and pleasure are contrary to one another. Article 4, whether all sorrow is contrary to all pleasure. And the answer is yes, if the object of both are contrary, like losing the soccer game versus winning the soccer game. If winning the soccer game is perceived as a good, and thereby would elicit pleasure, its opposite object and sorrow would be considered contrary to it. But if the objects of the passions are only disparate, that's Aquinas' word, then he continues, sorrow and pleasure in respect of objects that are not contrary, but disparate, are not specifically contrary to one another, but are also disparate. For instance, sorrow at the death of a friend, and then pleasure in contemplation. So not directly contrary to one another, but disparate is what Aquinas is saying here. Article 5, whether there is any sorrow contrary to the pleasure of contemplation. In a word from St. Thomas, no sorrow is contrary to pleasure taken in the very act of contemplation, nor is any sorrow connected with it save accidentally. So if we contemplate something sorrowful, like the Passion of Christ, it can be a cause of sorrow, or if contemplation causes weariness of the flesh, then it can be a cause of sorrow, but the act of contemplation itself has no sorrowful counterpart, kind of like the love and pleasure of warmth would have as its counterpart the sorrow of being uncomfortably cold. Article 6, whether sorrow is to be shunned more than pleasure is to be sought. In a word from St. Thomas, good is stronger than evil, but pleasure is desirable for the sake of the good, which is its object, whereas the shunning of sorrow is on account of evil. Therefore, the desire for pleasure is more eager than the shunning of sorrow. Article 7, whether outward pain is greater than interior sorrow. In this article, we receive a nuance from Aquinas between outward pain and sorrow, which is worth quoting. He writes, the cause of outward pain is a conjoined evil repugnant to the body, while the cause of inward pain is a conjoined evil repugnant to the appetite, while inward pain arises from an interior apprehension of the imagination or of the reason. So the evil of physical pain is repugnant to the appetite through its repugnance to the body, but the cause of inward pain is simply and directly repugnant to our appetite. And that which is simple and greater in its cause, which in this case would be the imagination or the reason versus the external senses, versus greater in its subject, the internal appetite, must then elicit a greater pain. So Inward pain is greater than physical pain by affecting higher faculties and more directly. St. Thomas says a sign of this is that one is more willing to undergo external pain than internal pain. Think about the physical pain one would rather endure than the internal pain of dishonor or shame. We have many examples in history of that. Many people would rather give their lives than give in to dishonor. We could say from a Christian perspective, look at how many men have undergone inexpressible physical pain, then experienced the pain of disappointing Christ, which would be felt in the heart. Article 8, whether there are only 4 species of sorrow. Are there 4 kinds of sorrow within the larger category of sorrow? And there are, according to St. Thomas. The first is pity, which is sorrow for another's evil, but is taken as relating to oneself, like we consider what happens to our friends to have happened to ourself. Envy is the second, which is a sorrow at another's good, but is taken to be an evil for us. Think of the sorrow of keeping up with the Joneses, as the saying goes. Third, anxiety, which is a kind of resting in some perceived evil that then weighs on the mind, making escape seem impossible. Finally, we have torpor, which I hope I'm pronouncing correctly, which is a sorrow so debilitating that it seems that one cannot even move or speak under its weight. And as a last and final note, the sorrow of repentance, because its proper object is one's own evil, which is the same object of sorrow, just in general, does not merit its own species or unique kind within that broader category of sorrows. That's why it's not included here as a distinct species. And that brings us to an end of another episode. We have just finished covering questions 34 and 35 of the Prima Secundae, that is, of the goodness and malice of pleasures and of pain or sorrow in itself. My name is Austin Habish with Think Catholic, and I cannot wait to see you tomorrow.